Thank you very much, Matthew. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the Forum for your kind invitation, and thank you especially for this venue, which I find remarkable. It's lovely and very historic. I must be a very odd fish here this afternoon. A bank talking at a technology conference. Well, I hope the reason I'm here is fairly obvious. We have policies, regulations, and all that. We have technology, but actually, to make it all happen, we need to finance the investment up front. And as a number of questioners have pointed out, the returns on the investment can take very long periods. I think I've heard 5 years and 20 years. And not every bank is available, or not every organization can stomach that kind of appetite. And from what I've heard this afternoon, most of this financing is going to come from the public sector, so from the government or from state-owned enterprises. The EIB has a slightly different approach, and that goes back to our origins. As you can see, we were set up at the same time as the European Economic Community back in 1958 under the Treaty of Rome. This means, our history is really the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War, and that people regard us as having a counter-cyclical role. So, for example, when the 2009 financial crisis hit, the EIB was expected to step in and support government's investment so that governments didn't have to take the full burden. And I think that's a kind of model here which might be applicable in India, where an organization can shoulder some of the burden alongside the private sector and not leave the whole burden to be carried by the public sector. The main purpose of the EIB is to support the EU's objectives. And when it comes to energy, the COP21, we made a commitment at COP21 in Paris that some 35% of the EIB's investments would be climate action related. Of course, we have more fundamental objectives that some of our other speakers have talked about in terms of promoting the energy reliability for the whole of Europe, the integration of the various European electricity supply networks, and of course, more fundamentally, to support the economic development. And I think those sound like very lofty objectives, but I think they're directly relevant to the business case for smart meters. Sorry, I should just pay attention. So, the EIB is, of course, the European Union's bank. It's probably not an organization you've heard of. A very common reaction when I first meet people is a blank stare. Who are you? Well, we're actually a fairly large bank. We're the largest supranational lender in the world. We lend about 80 billion euros a year. We're entirely self-funded, meaning that we raise our funds out on the commercial markets. We're a not-for-profit, so we pass on that financing advantage to our borrowers. A substantial part of our fundraising is in the form of green bonds. So we issue bonds that people buy with the intention that the proceeds of those bonds are used entirely for green investments. I should just point out that whilst we're doing about 80 billion a year, some 10% of that is outside the European Union. So roughly 8 billion a year, of which half goes to neighborhood countries, so the ex-Soviet Union, North Africa, the remainder going to Asia and Africa. The energy is a very big part of what we do. So last year, or sorry, I should say 2015, I don't actually have the 2016 figures yet, But in 2015, we did almost 14 billion euros in energy, and that was divided up roughly. Most of it went to, sorry, I can't read the color scheme here on my black and white printout, but energy networks was a very substantial part of that. I would just add that in India, we've been active for about 10 or 12 years now, and we have quite a large portfolio. In the last 3 years, we've invested 500 million euros with 3 organizations, with the State Bank of India, SREI, and IREDA. In terms of our European experience, for us, the smart grids and advanced meters, you'll see from the pie chart on the right that nearly 55% of our lending in energy goes towards smart grids, or grids, I should say, in total, of which a portion will be smart grids. A significant part of that was towards advanced metering, and we did about 14.5 million, or financed about 14.5 million smart meters last year. The context for this, is the legislative background in which we're operating. This has been an evolution underway for quite some time, for 10 to 15 years, and we've been gradually incorporating in the EU directives, the various EU directives, and I should, of course, add the Clean Energy for All in there in my list. But we've been gradually incorporating comms, monitoring, and all the control requirements that come along with that. And they form a very key part in the EIB's decision to lend or invest in particular projects. And in July 2013, we made a very specific reference to smart metering. I shouldn't ignore the role of smart transition, which is, alongside smart metering, is probably the 2 major sources of or requirements, investment requirements over the coming 4 to 5 years. Perhaps of interest to some of the questioners this afternoon is how we actually go about appraising what is important to us. So, of course, we're aiming the metering infrastructure at the small and medium-sized consumers, and we're aware that over time they are not simply going to be consumers. They will become generators in their own right and storage devices. So the investments that we're making now have to serve the needs of a very different environment, not only highly distributed, but extremely complex. So we have to take into account more than simply the losses that are happening, technical or commercial. We also are looking at reliability and the establishment of new markets so that people become, in a way, their own marketplaces. How do we do this? Well, of course, when we're looking at investments, we not only look at the CapEx and OpEx implications of the investment, we're very much interested in the avoided costs. So when we're looking at the network, we have to look at it as a whole. It's not just the the CapEx that goes into the current network, but it's how much more flexible it makes the network to adapting to unpredictable wind or solar energy inputs into the system. We're also looking at the overall total energy efficiency. So clearly, if we're reducing technical losses, we have reduced investments going forward. And above all, we have reduced CO2 emissions. That's one of the major goals for the European Union. Of course, in the end, we have to convince the customers that they need to cooperate with us. And of course, there are, apart from the very interesting apps that they will get on their phones, there will probably be significant savings and give them more flexibility when their car becomes a storage device, or their house or their business becomes a storage device, and that they can sell the electricity. I didn't want to say too much more. I'm conscious of time running on. I just wanted to bring to your attention and link perhaps to some of the previous speakers, the investments that the EIB has been making. There's been a lot of focus this afternoon on electricity meters. For us, we include gas smart meters, and a substantial part of the rollout in France has been to do with the gas, which is a very important part of the EU energy mix. We've invested very substantially across Europe, primarily in Estonia, Poland, Slovenia, Italy, France, Spain, and the UK. You'll see, though, that the figures are still overall relatively modest, at 22 million meters across a population of 480 million people. So I think we've got quite some way to go. And in terms of scaling up, we have to work on the demonstration projects that a number of people have talked about. And these are not only in terms of metering, but in terms of storage and in terms of electrical cars, particularly in France, taking a strong lead there. And thank you, Mark, for your introduction to the Linky program. You'll see that we're also interested in the investment there, and we'll be hopefully putting in a substantial sum there. So I think I'll leave it there. I've left a few other notes in case anyone's interested more generally on smart grids, but that's really for another time. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate.